Welcome. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm guessing you're here for one of two reasons. Either you have already agreed to become a family advocate or you're learning more and kind of checking it out. But either way, we're so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much for watching this video. I want to give you a heads up before we start and let you know this is a presentation that was originally designed for people who are training in person. So we'll come to some sections about like discussion and things like that. I invite you during those sections to pause the video and take some time and reflect on those questions. And if you're watching this with somebody, to bring them in and potentially have some discussion at home or wherever you're watching this. All right, so thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in and get started. So we want to start with kind of an overview of the foster system and kind of how it works. This training will really focus on this kind of 30,000 foot view of what the job is and why we're doing it, why it's important, the sort of philosophy behind it. And then in future videos, we'll get more into kind of the nitty-gritty of actual specific strategies for intervention. So right now, let's just talk overview of the foster system. You will not be expected to answer all of the questions that your family or that your allies will have in the Family Advocate program, but we do want to give you kind of a general sense of here's how it works, here are the main players, here's the philosophy of the foster system, so that you can have conversation with them and kind of know what's going on. And as their questions or their needs exceed your capacity, I invite you to reach out. That is what I'm here for, that we're going to have other people as well and lists of resources and things like that. So you are not expected to know everything, but we want to give you this information to kind of make you a little bit more comfortable. So the Child Protective Services get involved, and they go by a whole bunch of different names, by the way. Sometimes they're called the department, sometimes they're called CPS, Child Protective Services, Department of Human Services, which is kind of a bigger catch-all. So they go by a lot of different names, and the names change from one state to another sometimes too. But we'll just call them CPS, or Child Protective Services in general. And they will remove children from the home because they have reasonable belief of one or more of the following: illegal drug use, unsafe conditions, abuse, that could be physical, sexual, medical, etc., neglect or abandonment, and in rare cases, parents may voluntarily surrender their children to pursue their own wellness or because they feel unable to care for their children. But that doesn't happen very often. It's usually one of those first four, or a combination of the first four. So the first kind of stop and think question for you is, I guess it's a couple questions. How does the department find out about these conditions? And then how might that make biological parents feel? So I invite you to pause this video, take just a couple minutes to think through that and consider how the department would get involved in the first place and where that would really start. All right, so hopefully now you've gotten a chance to think through this on your own, and I want to throw out a few ideas for you that you've probably considered. The department often finds out from a neighbor or a teacher or somebody at church, or if it's an infant, often there's testing, like drug testing, done in the hospital at delivery. And if the baby and or parents test or biological mother test positive for drugs at birth, then sometimes they'll get involved at that point. But almost invariably, it's a community member that is bringing the department in, right? The department doesn't act in a vacuum where they just somehow know about these situations. They are told by a community member. So that is likely to bring up all sorts of feelings for biological parents, feelings of betrayal, feelings that they're an outcast in the community, and it often contributes to sort of shame spirals and a tendency to self-isolate. So we want to fight against this to be able to do our work effectively. And there's sort of a natural tendency in the system, in this work, that a whole lot of people, maybe everyone, tends to villainize the biological parents. They're in this system for a reason, unless there's been some crazy injustice. Generally speaking, they're in the system for a good reason. And so we look at the fact that they're homeless or unemployed or drug addicts or that they've abused this child or whatever, and we can be judgmental about that. And again, it makes sense, right? Like some of this is just objective reality, but we often will spin it into a larger narrative that may or may not necessarily be true, and we'll often assign motives and we'll assign blame where it doesn't necessarily belong. So there are some bad assumptions that people often make that we want to be careful to avoid in this role. Number one, we often assume that they don't love their kids. And the reality is just much more complicated than that. Very rarely do they actually not love their kids. I've never seen a situation like that, but I think it's theoretically possible. Often they are stuck in addiction, and that addiction is taking biological precedent in their brain where they are choosing their addiction over their child, but doesn't mean that they don't love their child. If we took that addiction away, they might be excellent parents. For example, they may have some deep trauma. They may have something that they need to resolve in their own mental health or something like that, that is making them less able to show love for their kids well. But it doesn't mean that they don't love them. So we want to try to help them bring that love out and act in a way that is consistent with their hearts for their kids. Number two, they're weak. And again, it's just not true. A lot of times their stories are much more complicated and tragic than we could possibly imagine. And what we find when we get in proximity with these people, when we get to know them and get in a relationship with them, is we see a lot of ourselves in their stories. And at least my experience has been, when I hear about the path that these people have followed, I see these little forks in the road where I go, man, I've had some forks like that in my life where I had no idea this was going to be a life-altering decision, and where I just sort of happened to fall on this side because of good influences in my life or just a moment of clarity, but I could have gone the other way and it would have put me on a totally different path. So I think actually the fact that these parents are willing to engage with us in this capacity shows incredible strength. The fact that they're continuing to be part of this process shows incredible resilience. The fact that they're fighting for their kids, that they're fighting for their families, is really admirable. So we want to focus on that and not the ways that they've failed, while building strength into their lives so that they can overcome those obstacles. Number three, they're beyond hope. This is a tricky one, especially when you look at the overwhelming circumstances in some of these people's lives. It can be easy to go there, but this might be one of the most important pieces of our jobs as family advocates, is holding on to the hope, because they need us to. The bio parents need us to. They may not have hope in that moment, but we need to have hope for them. And I think that's the best way that we can maximize their potential for success, is by believing it's possible. If we don't believe it's possible, that's going to show through, that's going to bleed through. But if we treat them like they can achieve anything, then they're more likely to believe it. I just realized that my camera is a little bit encroaching. Let's try that. Let's see. So number four would be they don't want to change. And that's definitely a false assumption as well. A lot of times they don't know how. They feel like they've tried everything and they've been doing it alone, usually. And so we can, through the Family Advocate Program, we can give them some systems, some perspectives, some activities, some ways to look at things in a new light, connect them with some resources. We can give them all sorts of new ways to approach change and to be more successful with change. It doesn't mean that they don't want to, but it likely means that they, the fact that they're here likely means that they just didn't know how. So let's consider the real truth behind why parents have their children taken. Here's another question to discuss, or a couple questions again. Why would bio-parents find themselves in this situation? Like, before CPS gets involved, what might be some of the root causes, the things that led them to having this kind of situation in life in general? So go ahead and take a moment and pause, and then we'll come back and discuss a little bit. Okay, so let's look at some options, and these are just a few. These are just some possibilities. Oops, sorry, let me move this, there we go. These are just some possibilities of what your ally may have faced, and we're going to use the term ally with the bio-parents because you really are working together, and you're in different positions, just like allies, right? Allies are not in the same country, they're not in the same place, and they have different levels of resources and different cultures often and all sorts of stuff like that, but they are working together toward a common goal and supporting one another. And sometimes that means they're not really doing a lot. Sometimes it's just like they're not doing a lot together, I should say. Sometimes it just means like, hey, over there, we're friends, you know. And so there's something to be said for that here too, that we're in a supportive role, we're working toward a common goal, but we're certainly not doing all the work. We each have our own battles to fight sometimes, but we want to do what we can to support, to share resources, to be on their team, on their side. So anyway, some of the possibilities of what your ally may have faced and may be grappling with currently. There are a whole bunch of them, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but they may be dealing with any combination of these things you see on the screen here. Trauma is a big one, that they may have trauma from their past that's unresolved or that's continuing to influence the way that they act currently. They're often victims themselves. Often people who've been treated unfairly in their past, and those broken models in their history sort of influence how they act today. And it's not an excuse, but it does help to understand some of the dysfunctional behaviors that we see. And that's true of us too, right? Like we can look at our parents or role models that were imperfect and some of the dysfunction that we've inherited from them. The more extreme that those situations are, a lot of times the worse our situation is in terms of those negative things that were modeled for us or that were done against us. So mental illness could be part of it. Addiction, neglect, shame certainly can play an important role. Underprivilege is an interesting one that can be a little bit controversial. But this is to say that we all have ways in our life, well, probably all, most of us have ways in our lives that we just have circumstantial disadvantages, right? We just have fewer opportunities than other people. And again, this is not to say that this is an excuse for staying where you are, but it can be an explanation for why you are where you are. Some people just have more obstacles to overcome, and so we want to help try to bridge that gap by offering support, offering resources, offering community, that kind of thing. All right, so after intake is completed, that's like when they bring the child into the situation, the child is assigned an ongoing caseworker from the department. While this caseworker primarily serves the child, they often function as the primary point of contact between the bio-parents and the department as well. So this has some inherent challenges that we'll talk about, but it's also important to know this is a high turnover position. A single case could be overseen by 3 or more caseworkers before it's resolved. In fact, the average turnover I've heard is somewhere around 8 months for that role. So everybody's new, right? Like a lot of times, especially in a complicated job like this, a lot of times it takes a year to really fully master what you're doing, which means that on average, the caseworkers are often never masters of what they're doing. And so we want to have grace for them there, but we also want to acknowledge some limitations there. And one of the things that I want to talk about here is just the fact that relationship is conflicted. The caseworker is there to serve the child, but the parents, the bio-parents, often need things that are different from what the child needs. And depending on the caseworker's view of how harmful the parents are, and what the best needs of the child are, those may be at odds with trying to help the parents re-enter that situation. So there's some complication there. We'll talk about a little bit more about that later. So if you were a bio parent whose child was removed from your care, how would you feel about this caseworker? So I invite you to take a moment and pause and think through this question. We'll come back in just a moment. Okay, cool. The second question is, how easily would you trust this person, and how likely would you be to accept help from them? Go ahead and take a moment and pause and think through that question as well. Awesome. So hopefully, having a chance to think through this, you see some of the conflict of interest that's inherent in that role. And this is part of why it's so important to have the family advocates, because we are not conflicted. Although we care about the children immensely, our only goal is to support and help the bio parents. And this is all built on the premise of mountains of research that show that the best outcome for children in the Department of Human Services, when they're involved with Child Protective Services and children get separated from their parents, we know that research shows the best outcome is for children to be reunified with their families. So we're serving that end. We're just coming at it from a different angle, because there are a lot of people caring for the kids and there's nobody caring for the bio parents. And the closest that we get is often the caseworkers, but we see through these questions and this kind of reflection that their relationship is inherently conflicted. And at the very least, even if the caseworker is doing everything right, which they often are when it comes to the bio parents, even if they're doing everything right, bio parents are naturally and understandably distrustful of anybody who represents the department, because that is the entity that took their children. So how could they possibly be for me as a bio parent and trying to help me at the same time as they've been the ones who've destroyed my family? So the family advocates can step into that role instead and be a party who's just like, I'm just here to help you, the bio parent. I'm here because I believe in your family, because I believe in you, and I want to do what I can to support you reunifying and healing your family. All right, let's talk about some more kind of overall system stuff and people you might encounter in this process. The child may also be assigned a guardian ad litem, or a GAL, as they're often referred to. The GAL is an attorney employed by the court system to investigate and advocate for the best interests of the child. The GAL's voice is often very influential in the outcome of a case when it's contested in court. So the GAL, you might interact with, you might hear about, and again, the GAL is there for the child, not for the bio parents, although they sometimes will interact with the bio parents, and certainly will interact with the bio parents' attorneys. They each will have a court-appointed attorney as well. Then we have court-appointed special advocates, or CASAs, as they're often known. This volunteer maintains a relationship with the child and facilitates communication between parties, as well as advocating for the child's best interest through a report written to the court. This only happens when a case is court involved. And you'll see that note at the bottom of the screen here. In fact, both of these roles only come into play when the court is involved, which could take 3 months or more, and sometimes doesn't happen at all. So both of these people will understand the preference for reunification, but their sole responsibility and allegiance is to the child. So they often won't work with the bio parents at all. As I mentioned before, this system's primary goal is reunification of children with their biological parents. And the path to reunification is laid out in the treatment plan, which typically needs to be completed within 1 to 1.5 years, but sometimes longer for older children. We're going to try to think about much shorter timelines, because this role is, we're really asking volunteers for 1 hour per week for 6 months. So we want to make it something that's not a huge life-altering commitment for volunteers, but we also want to help the biological parents think in terms of how can we resolve this faster than we need to, instead of thinking about like sneaking it in under the timeline. Because people will generally rise to the expectations that we set for them, and a long timeline, like a year or a year and a half, can actually be counterproductive. Part of this comes from my experience as a school teacher. I used to oversee something called the extended essay, which was like a 30+ page research paper. Depending on all the appendices and all that, it was often 30 pages or more. It's just a beefy, massive bear of a project. And we used to take a year for students to write it. And there wasn't a whole lot of support, but it was a year long. So it was like, you got tons of time. Of course you can do this. 30 pages in a year, no big deal at all. But students were still getting overwhelmed. And every time they sat down to write it, they were just thinking about writing this 30-page paper, and they just didn't know where to start. So almost invariably, not invariably, there were some students who were just really standout students, but most of the students would wait until the last month to do any real work. And far too many students waited until the last week or the last 2 weeks or something like that. And then they really struggled. And some of them got to that point and were so overwhelmed that they just quit the whole program and just gave up because they felt like they couldn't do it. So what we did instead to increase our success in that program is we shortened the timeline from a year to 6 months, actually less than 6 months. 1 semester was the timeline. And we increased the support and the relationship. So there was a lot more one-on-one, a lot more breaking it down. Instead of a 30-page paper, it was like, okay, today we're just going to work on this piece. Let's do this piece today, then I'll give you some feedback, then we'll check in, and then let's do this piece tomorrow. So it was always just a digestible, okay, here's something we can all agree you can do by the next time. So there was a lot of accountability, a lot of relationship, a lot of structure, and it never felt like a 30-page paper. But it was also a shorter timeline. So we were in the groove, we'd stay in the groove, do the stuff, get the thing, get it done, and then we'd be done, instead of what happened with a year timeline, which was often, okay, oh yeah, we have this big paper due, let's work on this for a little bit, and then let's forget about it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then come back to it, do a little bit more. So they really lost momentum that way. I think this all applies to the treatment plan and to what we're trying to accomplish with biological parents, because we want them to be focused on this, we want to have a sense of urgency, and we want to maximize our impact as family advocates as well. Within 6 months, we should know the trajectory of a case and whether or not this relationship is working. If it's working, awesome. You have the option as a volunteer to extend that if you would like. But if it's not working, we want to go somewhere where we can be more effective. All right, so as we mentioned before, research shows, and I can send this presentation to you if you'd like, and you can link to it and see the actual research or some of it, but that it shows that reunification with biological parents who've successfully addressed underlying concerns is the best possible outcome for children. I want to camp out on this a little bit because it can feel so wrong when this parent has abused or neglected this child, when this parent seems so unsuited to the task of parenthood. How could this be? How could that be the best outcome? Why not take that child and put them in a family that's just thriving, where the parents have never had any of these issues? Why isn't that better? So I want to invite you to pause and think through that, really think critically about why reunification is best for children, and why might it be the best option for the community. So take a moment and think about that, and then we'll come back and discuss. Okay, so why reunification is best for children? This really comes down to a almost like supernatural bond between parent and child. There really is no substitute for that. And when a child, especially when a child knows their parent and then is taken from them, that's always their parent in their mind. You can have other loving adults, you can have other people who take parent-like roles, but they'll always know that's my mom or that's my dad. And separating them from that leaves this lasting wound. That's the biggest thing. So we'll see this a lot in the system, where even when a child's been abused or neglected, they will look back at their parents and still want to go back to them, even though that situation is worse than where they currently are. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times. And so if we can get that to be a healthy environment, a healthy situation, then it's allowing those wounds to heal. And it may never be perfect. It's not to say that the trauma ever goes away, but it's like a positive way to address and process that stuff instead of what often happens, which is where children are permanently separated from their parents and there's no closure for that. There's no healing. They always have to wonder, does my parent love me? Why couldn't they keep me? All of that kind of stuff. And it's a lasting wound. But it's also a lasting wound in the community. When you think about it, these people are homeless and or unemployed and or addicted to drugs, all sorts of things that cause a fiscal drain on the community and the support services that we have. But actually foster care and parents involved in the system, there's this intersection of all sorts of societal ills, of incarceration, as we've mentioned a bunch of times, drug abuse, sex trafficking, homelessness, unemployment, like all of these things intersect in this area. So if we're leaving the parents who are experiencing those things, who are basically contributing to those problems, if we just leave them there and take their children away and continue to have them isolated from the community, those problems persist. But if we can look at those people who are enmeshed in those problems and support them and bring them back into the community and help them have more functional ways of living so that they can actually contribute to the community, we're helping them, but we're also helping to resolve some of these other problems in society. So it's really best for the community if we can bring them into functional families as well, instead of kind of leaving them where they are. And in all of this, they have a role in this too, right? Sometimes I could talk about like our role in bringing them in and helping them and all that kind of stuff. Of course they have a role. This is a collaborative thing. This is a partnership. And we can't do it all on our own. So we'll talk about some of that as well. All right, so the family advocate's primary objective is to support a bioparent in completing the treatment plan with fidelity. While the obvious benefit is the family being reunified, there's an added benefit of helping the bioparent to develop new skills and confidence, contributing positively to the community, and hopefully avoiding similar CPS involvement in the future. Because there is a problem with what's called recidivism as well, which is like re-entry into the same system. When we don't help the bioparents, when they don't get what they need, it's usually not just about this child. A lot of times they end up having another child in the future, and then we see the cycle continue. So when we can reunify and help give them the skills and the support that they need to have a functional family, that also means there's another child later that's not going to be in the system, in general. All right, so this is a good time to check in and kind of see how you're feeling about all this, because this has been a lot. This has been some heavy stuff, a lot of intense conversation. So I invite you to pause and think through, how do you feel about this so far, as well as what questions you have. So take a moment and pause, and we'll come back in a moment. Okay, so how you feel about all of this? It's heavy stuff. There's a lot to this. Questions that you have, I invite you to keep those in your mind and see if they get answered through the course of the rest of this training and the other modules. And if they don't, I invite you to reach out, because I want to make sure that number one, that we have the best training that we can, but number two, that you feel good about the role that you're considering stepping into here. All right, let's go ahead and move on for now. So first of all, what will I do as a family advocate? What am I supposed to actually do? So hopefully you understand a lot about the philosophy now, but what is your role really going to be? So this is a graphic that kind of represents our framework, our general approach. So we'll break this down in a moment, but this is, well, let's just go to the next slide. This is kind of the full picture, but let's go to the next slide that'll kind of break it down. So we're going to start with the gracefulness and unconditional love expressed through trustworthiness, faithfulness, and empathy. This is step number 1 for us, and this can take a while. This is that relationship building, trust earning, that kind of stuff. And we're doing that first because even though we want to address the underlying factors in their lives, we can't start there. Okay, let's just talk about the fact that you're a drug addict or whatever, right? Like, first we have to, like, how are you doing? Like, tell me what you love about your kids, right? Like, that kind of stuff, to validate their humanity and help them feel trusted and feel like a person again instead of an offender or someone who's just had their kids taken, but really to feel like someone worthy of love. If we can start there, then that allows us to start looking at truthfulness and how can we lovingly say the truth that needs to be said for their good, for the healing of their family, because there are difficult things that need to be talked about here, particularly the treatment plan and things like that. So as we build that foundation, we've got the foundation, we've got the pillars that kind of hold up the rest of this foundation of unconditional love, the pillars of gracefulness and truthfulness, and then we have community support organizations. So it's really important that family advocates understand you are not supposed to be doing all of this. Like, you're not in charge of all of this. You're not in charge of making them well. We want to be a lot of times a bridge between the bioparent and the community support organizations. There are so many great community support organizations out there, and we want to be a conduit. We want to help to connect the bioparents with those so that they can get some support from those organizations. And then we're really looking at how do we achieve overall well-being. That's what we're going for. If we can achieve overall well-being, that gives bioparents so much protection and a safe environment for them to explore and address the underlying factors. I mean, imagine if a bioparent had great social health, really was just connected with a bunch of other healthy, successful people, great spiritual health, felt a sense of hope and fulfillment and purpose in their lives and meaning, great mental, emotional health, just wasn't dealing with a bunch of trauma or anxiety or mental illness or anything like that, and great physical health, didn't have addictions, had everything they needed to be able to function in a physically healthy way in their lives. If they had all four, can you imagine them not getting their kids back? So it's a little bit of a different approach where it's not necessarily just going after the symptom. It's really looking more at the cause and the environmental aspects that help a person to thrive. And by doing that, we will be addressing the underlying factors, but we'll be doing it in a way that allows more sustainable success for the bioparents. Okay, so now as we explore trauma and how trauma affects our lives, we're going to actually transition from this training to some other videos that we have in a YouTube playlist. This one's going to conclude, and then there are going to be 3 more videos I'm going to invite you to watch. Each of those is going to give a different perspective on some of the work that we're going to be engaging in. But I encourage you, as you watch them, to think about what are some of the implications of how this applies to your work. The first video is going to teach us a lot about the role of childhood trauma on who we are as adults. The second one is it's really more from a teacher perspective. And so I want to invite you to think about how family advocates might be kind of like teachers in a sense, and how we can help our allies, the bioparents, how we can help them to be thinking more in learning brain rather than survival brain, which might kind of be the default, especially at first. So thinking about how we can help them to be in a learning brain mode. And then the last video is going to give some really great perspective on addiction. How does addiction work? How can it be overcome? It's not a guarantee that the people you're going to be working with will be drug addicts, but it's certainly a possibility. And even if they're not addicts, I think that video has some really helpful perspective in terms of just kind of what people need to thrive. and what people need to overcome the difficult things in their lives. He's going to talk about the concept of a cage. So thinking about, even if these people aren't caged by addiction, they are caged by something. So how can we address the cage? I think it's a great conversation starter, a great way to provoke some discussion. After you finish all three of those, we're going to come back and we're going to talk in particular about the third video and some kind of limitations maybe of that perspective. I think it's really valuable, and I think there's a little bit more to be said than can be said in that 15 minutes or whatever for that video. So enjoy those videos. I look forward to coming back and talking about that last one.